You have people like Pennington, Frederick Douglass, David Walker. You have all of these interpreters, African American interpreters, going against that, right? Pennington just comes out and says, God doesn't have to enslave us to give us the gospel. This argument is ludicrous. So you have this conversation going on where white Christianity, unfortunately, was willing to try to justify the unjustifiable and using scripture to do it. But at the same time, you have these African American interpreters saying, no, this is not of God. And you have people like Lemuel Haynes who comes out and says, actually, this is sin. This type of action, this is sin. And that's a move that many white interpreters during this time would not make. So you're right. They were bold in countering this notion that slavery was a blessing. And it was not only in the churches, it was in the media, if you would call the social media of that time. It was in the newspapers. I mean, it was a prevalent notion that slavery was actually a blessing to African Americans. So you have African Americans pushing back against that and saying, no, this is evil. This is sin. So you have that conversation going on during this time as well about the nature of slavery and how to talk about slavery, right? So you have the South trying to paint this beautiful rosy picture of slavocracy, but then you have people like Pennington, Harriet Jacobs, and others who escaped to the North, and they begin telling the story of what's actually happening during slavery and trying to open up the eyes of people in the North to what really is happening in the South. And so many of the slaves who escaped, their stories become evidence that what's happening in the South is not right and is not of God. So there's a lot of conversation going on in this time around slavery and what slavery means and what it is.
Yeah, and I love how you mentioned Lemuel Haynes about addressing it as sin. Like, this is a sin. And I think I remember one of the arguments was around husbands loving your wives and the importance for families to be together. And talk about theology and bringing things together, like arguing against slavery. Like, look how slavery is dividing families. And if you're truly a Christian family, husband and wives, families need to be staying together.
Yes. So you're mentioning one of the petitions. So when I did research for this book, one of the things I start with is looking at enslaved petitions. So as early as 1774, we have it's this petition written by enslaved Africans to the Massachusetts government to argue for their freedom. And one of the arguments, as you rightly point out, is Paul's words of husbands love your wives, children obey your parents. And so they quote Paul in this petition and they say, how can we follow the words of scripture when you're separating our families? And, there's no way the husbands can love their wives and the children can obey their parents because our families are taken from us. And so they make this really ingenious argument in this petition to argue for their freedom and liberation. And then they also quote Hebrews, let brotherly love continue. And they say, how can brotherly love continue when you are enslaving us? The two are mutually exclusive. So you have these African Americans who are using Paul in government documents to argue for their freedom. In another petition from 1779, you have the writers quoting Acts 17:26, where Paul says, God has made of one blood all the nations of the earth. And saying, we are all one humanity. We're one humanity. So no race has the privilege or the right to enslave another human being. So you have these really fascinating, sophisticated arguments and these legal documents, if you will, by African Americans arguing for their liberation and their freedom.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out this video clip from the Delgado podcast. To get more videos like this, simply subscribe here on YouTube. You can also download the full episode of each show on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or your favorite podcast player. Take care.